This video is brought to you by viewers like you. Thanks for letting me do this for so long. If you want a difficult game to play that keeps you occupied on the same problem for hours on end, Zelda games aren't usually the place to go. Sure, they have challenging moments, but it's one of Nintendo's flagship franchises. You can't expect them to be really difficult. As it turns out, if you want a Zelda game to fight back a bit more, you have to do it yourself through any of the impressive variety of fan-made challenge runs that range from fairly simple to kind of weird and obscure to absolutely insane all the way through. My task today is to find some of the hardest and talk you through all the ways they changed the games you know and love, with the added personal challenge of writing and editing this video before Tears of the Kingdom comes out. If any of these challenges carry over to that game, we'll call it good foresight. There's no better place to start with self-imposed Zelda challenges than the action game staple, the Pacifist run. It's also one of the easiest playthroughs to explain, although it is worth noting that only really Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are built to facilitate a pacifist approach, since Link is generally a merciless motherfucker and most obstacles in basically all of the games are set up to be approached sword first. That being said, Pacifist is definitely doable in the Zelda game of your choosing, but with a couple of notable caveats that prevent it from being completely smooth sailing. Outside of dungeons, pacifism is not just doable, it's not that difficult to do at all. It's kind of hilarious how bleak some of these Zelda games are and how Hyrule has been subjugated by some oppressive force, and yet the required number of fights are surprisingly low. Nearly all of them are in dungeons, and beyond mini-boss and boss fights that reward a little focused violence with new items and more health, you might end up in a room where the puzzle is to kill all the enemies or one particular enemy. True pacifism is, of course, impossible, since Zelda loves a boss fight, but it can be a lot of fun going down a route that gives you the next best thing. Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, and to a significantly lesser extent, Wind Waker sometimes, are more built around stealth, so there's the added element of avoiding conflict altogether instead of running away like a terrified idiot. I don't know, it's not very difficult, but it can be fun to retune your brain to avoid conflict. Playing Zelda with so much zen right now. Call me a starving video game journalist desperate to put my qualifications to good use and make my parents proud, because I'm about to compare The Legend of Zelda to Dark Souls. No wait, don't go, I have original things to say too! Yeah, okay, so this was fairly inevitable given how I'm talking about how to make a generally easy franchise so much harder, but digging down into the specifics, the dynamic of the 3D games changes so much by ditching your shield. I know swords get a lot of the focus in these games, and no defensive item will ever get the same kind of fanfare as the Master Sword, but some of the harder fights in this franchise do necessitate a decent understanding on how to use a shield properly. So logically, taking the shield away can have a pretty dramatic effect on how you work your way through a Zelda game. While possible in 2D games, you won't notice any significant difference until you give this a go in a 3D game, where suddenly, hey, now you don't have a safety net. It's a little hard to judge this challenge across every Zelda game, but you do get some interesting outcomes, like how Ocarina of Time funnels you nicely towards using the Begoran sword since you don't need your other hand for anything else. Wind Waker puts more of an emphasis on parry timing since screwing those up will now hurt a lot more. And Skyward Sword, oh, Skyward Sword. Shields are very important in this game, and not having one forces you to approach combat with a bunch of enemies in a completely different way. Declining a shield in Dark Souls helps to speed up combat since you can't just turtle behind a lump of metal the whole time, and I'm not gonna lie, Skyward Sword hits some of the same notes sometimes. Please tell me I'm the first person to compare this game to Dark Souls. For the love of God, tell me that's true. Hey guys, real quick, my channel has been approved for YouTube memberships now, so if you fancy supporting my channel more directly, you can become a member for as little as £1 a month and gain access to some nifty perks, as well as being featured on my channel page. Hit the join button below this video if that sounds cool to you. Thank you, and let's get back to the video. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in encouraging times where modern Zelda games let you explore the overworld in whatever order you fancy, but I don't need to tell you that this wasn't always the case. Replaying one of the older games can often get you wondering if there's anything you can do differently to spice things up, and wouldn't you know it, sometimes you can play through the dungeons in reverse order. That may sound bananas since Zelda games have long been married to their set order of obstacles and the freedom has only been there for the last decade, perhaps? But surprise surprise, with the right glitches you can do whatever the fuck you want. The big exceptions are unsurprisingly Breath of the Wild and A Link Between Worlds, which don't have a traditional dungeon order and can therefore be tackled without abusing any glitches, but also, more surprisingly, the first Zelda can be reversed without breaking anything too hard, other than your spirit and any windows in your house, because this challenge obviously puts the hardest dungeon at the start and gradually becomes easier over time. But going to Death Mountain from the start is, oh man, it's a lot. The other possible games are extremely reliant on glitches, to an extent that they barely resemble the base game. But I want to highlight Ocarina of Time in particular for being the most popular game for this challenge and already having some reasonable flexibility when it comes to dungeon order, although maybe not to this extent. Seeing Jabu Jabu done as an adult, man, what a world. If you didn't know much about the vast, exciting world of self-imposed Zelda challenges, it's likely that the only one that you would have heard of coming into this video was the 3-Heart Run. It's easily the most well-known challenge around and one of the easiest to implement. You're basically playing the game as normal, but you're not allowed to increase your health by picking up heart pieces or picking up the heart containers dropped from defeating a boss. You're not inconvenienced too hard by only being able to use a particular item or having to move everywhere backwards or some dumb shit like that. It's a normal playthrough, but you really can't afford to make too many mistakes. That's the primary takeaway from a 3-Heart Run, and it will encourage you to become more confident at some of the more challenging parts of Zelda games. Suddenly you start paying real attention to your healing items and how much damage attacks do, because if you aren't careful, you'll be spending a lot of time watching Link die and staring at the game over screen. Obviously, a 3-Heart Run is as challenging as the game you're playing. Skyward Sword gives you 6 hearts at the start, so it can't even do that right. But put this to work on something like Breath of the Wild or Zelda 2, and it's like you're made out of paper. I hope you like origami. Never mind Pokemon, you're heavily encouraged to collect them all in your average Zelda game. These are, after all, adventure games, and so it really is in your best interest to do some exploring and extra reading so you can pick up all the trinkets and upgrades and bugs. 100% isn't generally too hard as long as you're not going for all the figurines in the Wind Waker, because what kind of insane person would do that? So maybe you should be looking at doing the complete opposite instead, which has to be like 1% or like a negative percentage instead. Is that a thing? Can you do that? Minimalist runs are my fucking ooey gooey jam. Spread it thick on some chunky toast or my hairy nutsack, because this is one of those challenges that can be made as difficult as you're willing to go. Minimalist, in essence, just means that you're trying to complete the game with as few items as possible. Now, that may sound like you're playing a Zelda game in a very restrictive way that ignores anything even remotely optional, which does make it kind of similar to a 3-Heart Run, but what makes Minimalist runs so enjoyable is how flexible they are. You start by leaving behind all the upgrades to health and equipment, which isn't too hard to visualize, but then you start understanding what items are actually required to complete a Zelda game. Did you know that you don't need Epona in order to beat Ocarina of Time, or that with the right glitches you can skip heart containers in A Link to the Past? If you want to introduce glitches into the mix, then why not give the low percent run of Twilight Princess a whirl, where through some weird animation glitch you can skip a few dungeon keys at the bargain price of a playthrough that literally takes more than 24 hours to complete. What flavor would you like your torture, my good sir? I know I said that a pacifist run requires the least amount of explanation, but honestly, an optimal playthrough of Breath of the Wild is about as simple in theory as you could ask for. What's interesting about the Defeat Ganon run is that you're pretty much doing exactly what the game is asking you to do, or at least you're taking a very literal approach to defeating the bad guy. Breath of the Wild isn't being entirely serious when it gives you a new main quest upon finishing the tutorial on the Great Plateau, but with Nintendo opting for player freedom over general reason and logic, you better believe that you can waltz up to a Hyrule castle dripping in purple goo and surrounded by evil murder octopuses in the clothes you came out of the freezer in. Link doesn't even need prep time. The naked assault on the occupied Hyrule Castle was pretty brutal if you're unaware of exactly what any of that means. So here's the deets. You're working off of starting game health, abilities, and weapons, with only really that last one subject to change once you get to know these halls a bit better. The good news is that there's some tasty weapons and even tastier treats hanging around, but sadly, that's where the good news ends, since Hyrule Castle is full of powerful enemies that will very likely one-shot you and are almost guaranteed to swarm you in numbers. Heading to Hyrule Castle without first evicting the Blight Ganons from the Divine Beast means that you need to fight 4 challenging bosses in a row with starting game health and abilities. And hey, once you've done that, you've got the main fight with Calamity Ganon, where he has all of his health and some really nasty attacks to dodge. All of this is often too overwhelming for an unprepared player, and yet, with enough preparation, this is the fastest way to beat Breath of the Wild, and speedrunners make it look trivial. I don't need robots invalidating my arguments, thank you. The mere presence of this video is an admission that Zelda games generally aren't very difficult. One of the more simplistic challenges you can implement without having to change anything about how you play the game would be having 0 deaths, which is a mere byproduct of knowing these games too well and being unfazed by any and all obstacles. However, for the first time in this video, 0 deaths goes beyond being a self-imposed challenge and actually one that is rewarded in Link's Awakening, because this is the one and only Zelda game that is hiding a secret ending behind having 0 deaths on your save file. This has been the case since the original on the Game Boy, all the way back in 1993, and every version of Link's Awakening since then has had this hidden out back for the most talented of Zelda players to find. Link's Awakening isn't exactly the hardest Zelda game around, but when your margin for error is this fine and one mistake can undo hours of progress, you do start to see some of the harder parts of this game as significantly more tense. Of course, you can save every 5 minutes and merely reset whenever you fuck up if you're a giant weenie, but it's still a drastically different approach for a Zelda game. One where you're both not too worried about dying because it's Link's Awakening and not Super Meat Boy, but also there's that fear in the back of your head that if you become too complacent, you'll fail a challenge that technically isn't that demanding. It doesn't help that the final boss is likely one of the hardest in Zelda history, and with multiple forms to tackle, at least one of them could trip you up, and that's a hell of a distance to restart from if you didn't save. How's your confidence doing? Alright, forget what I said about the 3-heart run being the most famous challenge, because when Nintendo released Majora's Mask in the year 2000, they dangled a carrot in front of players that indirectly asked a very intriguing but ultimately difficult question. Can you beat this game inside 3 days? Not real life days, because that's actually something I did with a remake and I 100%ed it too, so that's obviously possible. But can you beat Majora's Mask from start to finish inside the allotted in-game 3-day time limit? The short answer is yes, absolutely, but that would only tell a fraction of the story, since you need to understand just how many things need doing in what effectively amounts to 54 minutes of real time before any adjustments. That's surely impossible, right? Well, yeah, it would be if it wasn't for the inverted Song of Time that bumps up your 54-minute timer to something more like 3 hours. That's just about enough time to follow an extremely streamlined path through the game that can't spare a moment of downtime. It's counterintuitive as all hell and includes steps like finishing off the first 2 dungeons after visiting the graveyard in Ikana, and having to do a good half of the required steps before 6 PM on the first day. That's the thing, it's not too challenging to beat Majora's Mask this way if you're following a guide or have previously mapped out exactly where you need to be at every minute of every day. And actually, Majora's Mask is kind of light on hard stuff that's required to beat the game anyway. Organizing this unique challenge is half the battle, and one that you'll likely lose if you're not intimately familiar with the game. Princess Zelda goes to all that trouble of turning up in a flashback to teach you a song that you don't even need more than once. I bet you feel silly now. So we tried taking the shield away, and that can be pretty difficult. So really, if you want to make a seriously difficult challenge, we should just take away the sword instead, right? What's Link gonna do without his sword? Nothing, that's what. He's gonna punch him like he can do in the Oracle games with the right ring equipped. Well, actually, swordless runs aren't that impossible, but you are a little restricted on what games are actually viable without some hefty glitch abuse. The primary source of Swordless Zelda Ring is the original Legend of Zelda, where despite that starting cave and its iconic status for kicking off an entire saga of high-octane sword action, you never have to meet the old man. Going alone is very dangerous and daunting in Zelda 1, since obviously this game was designed around Link having a sword, but it is impressive that you have options for how to do damage. Working backwards, you need an alternative to a sword, so the logical option is bombs and arrows, but both of those need to be bought. The same goes for the blue candle, which you can at least use infinitely, but it's a little awkward to aim, and if you miss, you have to kite an enemy into the fire until it goes out. So you need money, and you can't kill enemies to grind, so you have to rely on the few money caves in the game that are readily accessible without needing another item. Once you have your alternative weapon, Zelda 1 plays out mostly the same, although none of these are as flexible as a traditional sword. Except maybe the magical rod that you can swing like a sword. Hey, could you imagine doing a swordless reverse dungeon run of Zelda 1? Sounds like a lot of therapy waiting to happen. If you've played through enough Zelda remakes, you may have noticed a trend when it comes to difficulty. Most of them have some kind of heroes mode so as to incentivize veteran players to purchase this remake for more than just nostalgia. You can play the game that you love, but this time it's super duper hard. Twilight Princess HD for the Wii U had a special combination of enhanced difficulties that can make it a pretty goddamn challenging experience. There's hero mode as usual, so you take double damage, but if you scan the Ganondorf amiibo, that acts as its own separate modifier, so if you give yourself blue hearts during hero mode, you're now taking 4 times the usual damage. And that makes a lot of difference. The underrated knock-on effect of a 4 times damage run of Twilight Princess HD is that increasing your health is now unbelievably important. All those heart pieces and picking up a heart container after defeating a boss, it's like gold dust. Any attack that would have done 1 heart of damage now one-shots you at starting health, and late game enemies can leave a sizable dent in your health even with 2 full rows of hearts. You never feel all that safe, and what were originally small attacks from insignificant enemies can stack up ungodly quickly. If you want the perfect showcase of how ridiculous you can make this challenge, then I implore you to give both the Cave of Ordeals and the new Cave of Shadows a go. That's 50 and 40 consecutive floors of increasingly more challenging enemies with very restricted options for healing, and the Cave of Shadows forces you to be Wolf Link the whole time, and do you know what that does for you? Well, Wolf Link can't use potions to heal himself for one, but he also takes an additional double damage compared to Human Link. Do you want to take 8 times damage? No one wants that. And those are all the challenges I have for now. Do you agree? Is there a challenge I missed out? Are you enjoying Zelda month? Let me know in a comment down below. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more in the future, and hit that bell for notifications of every new upload. If you need something else to watch right now, I talked about the worst things in Zelda games last week, and I also want to thank my top supporters on Patreon, including Blue Catarade, Lima Pro, and Scott Riker. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.